Well, I want to cover some of the issues that we deal with in remote viewing of viewing so-called anomalous targets, because we view all sorts of different things and it raises different issues. And, a lot of people think sometimes if you just remote view something, it's going to give you all the answers you need and that's the end of it. And it's really much more complicated than that. I want to show you why. We know that remote viewing, however it actually works, our mind is like a funnel, at least our conscious mind. And as Ingo Swann pointed out a couple of years ago at one of the RV conferences, our mind takes in about 40 million bits of information a second, but only about 16 bits of that is in your conscious mind. The rest goes somewhere else. It's deleted. It's in your subconscious mind. And that's why you only perceive a very small sliver of reality when you're awake. But we know that there's a lot more, and remote viewing taps into this information that's hidden from the conscious mind by going below the level of the limit, the threshold of awareness. We can get more information than you think you have available to you by tapping into the right brain, the subconscious mind. Now, when we view, we typically use a target that we put in a folder, or we have a computer choose it, and it's not shown to the viewer ahead of time. It's called a blind target. You've seen this before, so we're not going to spend too much time on this. But we have an intended target, and then we have the viewer's session, the viewer's description. If it works well, you can see that they get a very good description of the target picture. And when we're dealing with verifiable targets that are kind of things that we've visited, places we've been to before, we know kind of what the viewer is getting and kind of sense if they're kind of on target or kind of off target. So typical targets are kind of easier to deal with because we can kind of verify if the viewer has actually gotten accurate results. But what do we do with other sorts of targets when we put our minds, our subspace minds, our remote viewing minds into off-planet targets, other sorts of places, locations, peoples, and events where we can't actually go there ourselves and get verification? Is this a face, as some people have argued, or is it just a pile of rocks? We could take remote viewers and send them there and see what results we get, theoretically, and get a sense of what actually we're looking at here. Some of us have heard Tom Van Flandern present evidence that there's something to do with the way the cameras are focused from the NASA orbiters, and it kind of makes it look different and so forth. But this is typically the type of question we want to look at when we're viewing so-called anomalous targets. Now, there are three phases of viewing anomalous targets or extraterrestrial types of information that I can perceive, and this is very basic. We have SRI and unofficial military projects from folks like Pat Price and Ingo Swann and others. And again, those are unofficial projects. They're just things that were done on their own for their own interest, from my knowledge. We have post-military civilian projects like what occurred at the Farsight Institute, which I was a participant in, which included off and on-planet extraterrestrial activity. A lot of those themes were continued from former military viewing unofficial projects that folks there had gotten interested in. And the third phase that I can perceive most recently are UFO crash retrievals, including, and there are probably more than this, Devil's Hole crash in Nevada in 1949 that some prospectors saw, and the Desert Range Experimental Station in Utah from 1953, which we'll look at in a second. So if we look at Pat Price here in the center, he was a very accurate viewer, one of the most accurate viewers that most people ever know. And in this, just to give you a sense of what he could do, at this target site from Semipalatinsk, the so-called Peanut site, he was able to view this gantry crane. And Russell Targ and Paul Smith can tell you more about this, but he was able to actually see this site that the CIA was very interested in. Now, the CIA artist had drawn this sketch here, and he was able to reproduce it. He actually said, apparently, that he was lying down and could see this big crane going over him. Then he went into a building nearby that no one had information about. And he died then later on. A few years later, apparently, an agent was able to go into that building and describe things that Pat Price had seen, which no one had seen yet. So we know he wasn't just viewing the feedback. He actually was at the target site, in a sense, and was able to walk around and get information. Now, apparently, according to the story, he was able to, one day he came in and he said that he had perceived 4 different extraterrestrial bases. I think it was to Russell, one of which was at Mount Hayes, Mount Zeal in Australia, and Zimbabwe, and a site in the Pyrenees. He said these were actually extraterrestrial bases with different functions, one of which was rest and recreation. Another of these bases was a site for training and so forth. Now, other viewers later viewed this same locations and came to different conclusions. Mel Riley did see a person at a control panel, and another viewer who I talked to said that these were correct locations, but that these were actually over the horizon radar installations. They were not extraterrestrial. So what are you going to do with this? We have one viewer, very good, top-notch viewer, who says that these are extraterrestrial bases. Another viewer, equally good, or perhaps in the same league, says that these are actually U.S. military installations. So it really doesn't resolve what they actually are, but apparently the locations are correct. Then we had some of Ingo Swann's viewings. Ingo, seen here in the center, one of the first, I would say, kind of off-planet viewing projects that I know about. He was able to view Jupiter before the Voyager mission got out there, and was able to describe features of Jupiter that had not been perceived yet, including rings. And later on, Voyager did perceive that. So it showed that remote viewing does work even at very large distances. He later wrote a book called Penetration about extraterrestrial activity on the moon, which he said he was commissioned to view for a secret intelligence agency. It's a very good book if you can get a hold of it. It's out of print. The events took place, I believe, in 1977, and he wrote the book in 1998. And in the book, he's very explicit about the fact that these individuals he dealt with, he gives them code names here like Axelrod, that this confirmed everything he had ever heard about the reality of the extraterrestrial phenomena. Now, curiously enough, for reasons I don't understand, he won't talk about this topic anymore on the radio or even at the conferences. There could be a good reason for that, but this is the last we know about his activities. Viewing the moon, he saw extraterrestrial activity. They didn't tell them this was extraterrestrial, but he was able to discern this from the types of information he was getting. Now, this could confirm what we've seen over the years in terms of pictures of what appear to be structures on the moon. Perhaps this is what he was viewing. But it's a sort of thing that you can use remote viewing to do to see if it can confirm information that you're getting from other sources. Now, my first experience with these sort of targets came at the Farsight Institute that I used to participate in. One of the first ones I did with this was a crop circle target. Now, here's one thing I want to mention, which is very important. We typically refer to these as anomaly targets. I don't think that's a good name for them. I think we should call them something like variable transition target. And the reason is, if you call it an anomaly, you're kind of front-loading the whole session with a certain intent. And when the viewer is going to view it, they're going to almost pick up the idea that it's anomalous. As you know, most of the technology around us was an anomaly at one point. It really depends where you are in the level of scientific progress. Things that are anomalies one year, like airplanes, are not anomalies anymore. So this is the first crop circle I viewed. Now, this is very interesting because at the time I viewed this target, I didn't know what a crop circle was. I had never heard of the term consciously. And so I did this target without any preconceptions about what crop circles were. And what I got were these individuals on the ground with a circle, kind of hills behind, and energy kind of moving in and out. And since, as some of you saw my presentation last year, I've been going to England ever since these sessions to kind of figure out what was going on here, to get my feedback, so to speak. This actually turned out to be a very accurate session. Now, as you know, I believe a lot of these large ones, like this Milk Hill formation from, Windmill Hill from 1996, a lot of these are man-made, and we've found the people who make these, we know them. I actually think I can now identify the individuals that I drew here in the P3, which is kind of astounding because I haven't had very many sessions where I actually could name the individuals in the drawing. But I think I actually know who these individuals are now. And yet here I'm doing this. It took me years to figure out what was actually going on here, and yet I can identify it. So I think this actually is a very early, correct session, very accurate data. It seems to be individuals on the ground. A lot of work went into this site. The beans are figuring something out, focus of intention, so forth. And so that shows you can get some, even these targets that are so-called anomalous, if you spend some time doing some research, you can actually get information, and they're not so anomalous anymore. Now, there's a lot of things about crop circles we still don't understand about the energy, as I mentioned last year, battery failure, and so forth. But we do know some of the individuals that are involved in constructing them. And so this isn't really quite an anomalous target in the same way it was when I did it in 1996, I think, if you see my point. This particular target was the Milk Hill Formation of 1997. Now, what's interesting about this individual detected these roaring sounds at the site, and she said it's placed to break contact with the real world. When I went around to this particular location, I talked to some of the people in the area, and what they said is they heard roaring sounds that night when that crop circle was made. Whatever made those roaring sounds. Now, the interesting thing is, having to do with extraterrestrials here, is this particular viewer, we actually did this session right here in this hotel, by the way, when we were using this space for our classes. She didn't like paranormal topics. She didn't like things having to do with extraterrestrials, anything kind of spooky or weird. So she actually stopped the session. She didn't like it. But the interesting thing is, about a week later, she had a sighting of a UFO in Estes Park at night, about 30 feet down from her car, very big, and she no longer felt afraid of it. So this is kind of like a reverse example of resonance, where doing the session actually seems to open you up to new experiences, rather than just as something to get information about. This is a picture that someone gave us from an individual that worked for the government who wanted to see if we could actually do this target. It's from Area 51, S4. You can see the MiG fighter planes in front of the hangars. This is the drawing that the viewer drew, very close replication of the picture. The viewer was in Salt Lake City. All I told her was, would you like to do a session? She said yes. I said, here are the coordinates, end of conversation. And she was able to reproduce the picture pretty closely. And so when she walked around into the hangar, she said she saw silver discs. Now, we can't verify that because we can't go in there, but we can see that the rest of the session was accurate. This is the Rocketdyne facility in Simi Valley outside of LA. A UFO researcher asked us to take a look at this after there was a crash there of a triangular disc in the late 90s. And he wanted to see if this facility was connected to LA in any way with underground tunnels. I haven't been there and I don't know too much about it, but the viewer, without any prompting from us, did pick up, said this is connected to a nearby city, this base. So it's kind of interesting we get some sort of same sort of information that the researcher was looking for. When we do UFOs, sometimes you just get the sense of the roundness of the object. There's some level of verification there, the color, so forth. The Phoenix lights is something that we looked at. I don't know if these are flares or not, but the first viewer got something that looks to me more like flares than really solid objects or different objects. But the second viewer got something that's a lot like Governor Fife Symington described, which is a large black metallic triangle, which thousands of people apparently saw that night over Arizona. So one viewer got something that looks like the lights, and the other viewer got something that looks like the larger object that was seen earlier in the evening. Mexico City, 1997, we sent the viewer, a number of viewers to look at this. One of the viewers kind of described the disc next to the building, as you can see, and had a sense that it was a UFO going from one destination to another. Another viewer described it. He got a feeling he shouldn't be there looking at it. Another viewer got a space-age chair and then described mechanical intelligence with a pointed head and careful planning. And so we actually can't go inside the UFO, but we got people to locate the object, to identify the size and so forth. So that is some level of contact you get with it. The point I'm making here is that all of these targets, whether it's verifiable targets or targets that are harder to verify, have some degree of verifiability. It's never just one or the other. After all, if you took this glass and you said you wanted to view it, I mean, we'd all agree it's kind of a plain, ordinary target. But if we threw in some dark matter and then tossed it into a black hole, it'd become an anomalous target. You see, it all depends on the context, and that's what I'm trying to say here. It depends on your state of knowledge, which is changing from year to year. Here's one which I would call more of an imaginal target. This is the Gray's Galactic Gateway near Earth. And I can't verify this unless I get aboard a Gray ship and see one of their maps if there's really a gateway nearby. But it's certainly fun to do one of these targets once in a while, even though this has zero level of verifiability with the technology we have right now. We've also viewed sometimes future announcements of extraterrestrial activity from a government source. And that's interesting to do, something that would happen in the future. And sometimes we get information about that. Now let's look at the last part of we want to look at here is crash retrievals. This is a new phase of remote viewing, something I've learned about from the Woods at their conference. You can take viewers, and actually it's a very interesting way to use it because you have a lot of information going in here. And where you don't have a lot of information, you can get more information. At this site near Garrison across from Great Basin National Park, if you've ever been out there, there's the Desert Range Experimental Station where in 1953 witnesses saw something crash in that area, right in this lake bed. And you can see it here from these pictures. We'll get close in here. That there's this large anomalous triangle. Now, various military sources told Linda Moulton Howe that this indeed was a craft that was very large, too heavy to move, too dense to cut, so they just buried it. And what we're told is that remote viewers were later sent to look at this site, and I believe Joe McMonagle found that indeed there was a crash here, but what he got was that it had been moved since then. So we have different types of information. But it is an example where you can actually coordinate remote viewing with eyewitnesses and military insiders to kind of get more sense of what's going on. So the point is, I think remote viewing is used best when it's used in conjunction with other sources, because by itself sometimes you may get information, but you may have to wait a long time to actually verify what you're getting. So any questions so far about any of that? Thanks for listening.
We have time for Q&A. Here's one right here.
In these remote viewing tests, how could you exclude the possibility that the remote viewers were, rather than clairvoyantly sensing something at a distance, they were picking up by telepathy from your own mind, because the experimenter, you, knew what the target was, right? Therefore, it could have been telepathy.
Right. What you're talking about is an issue when the viewer is actually viewing the picture, perhaps sitting here on the table, than actually going to the site. And one way to get around that is actually to see if the viewer can pick up more than is in the picture, or more than even the tasker knows about. And if they did pick it up, like Pat Price picking up these steel metal gores inside the building that no one knew about at the time, then you know that the viewer actually went to the site versus just reading the mind. That's called telepathic overlay, and it's definitely an issue, and it's something to pay attention to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the concern was more than you're looking at the picture. If you know the answer or your desired answer and you're sitting with a viewer, there doesn't even need to be a picture. He can get the answer directly from you. So the idea of doing remote viewing where you have profound amount of information concerning the target and the answer you want is really quite a bad idea.
Well, that's the thing. But if the viewer comes up with more information than you even knew about, then you knew they're not reading your mind. I mean, that's certainly an issue. If all they ever get was what you saw, then you could say they were doing that. But it's something to pay attention to. But I don't think you can ever totally exclude that unless you actually go through a lot of protocols and make sure it's double-blind and so forth. Then you would exclude that possibility entirely. But it's certainly something to think about. Absolutely.
So what happened after they found that triangular shadow? I'm sure they did not just say, oh, well, too many blackberries, we can't go.
The can you tell me more specifically what you're referring to? Are you referring to the Phoenix Light Triangle or that triangle in the desert?
The triangle in the desert.
In the desert.
We have to ask Bob would know about the update on that. It's not my specialty. Is there any update on that, Bob?
I heard the briefing myself, but I don't remember what the follow-up was. I mean, after
About
that.
the DRES site, the Desert Range Experimental Station. Is there any update on the information about that site?
No,
Garrison,
not that I
Utah?
have. Not that I
No?
have.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks very much.
Questions?